Getting rid of prisons is a long-term project. We're not changing the cages for other cages. It's not a trade-off. Hi, I'm Dr. Kim Wilson. I am the co-host and producer of the Beyond Prisons podcast. So Beyond Prisons is a storytelling and political education project. My co-host Brian Sonnenstein and I founded in 2017. And our goal was really to create a platform where we were telling different kinds of stories and pushing back against the prevailing media narrative around prisons. We are decidedly abolitionist. We also tend to bring on folks that are, directly impacted in whatever way. So whether it's someone who has spent time in prison, is currently in prison, people who are doing the work around transformative justice. I have two sons who are currently serving life in prison without the possibility of parole. So this is something that I live. This is not just my academic work or my work in media. This is my life every single day. There's so many of us who are impacted. And I would argue that all of us are impacted by prisons, even if we admit it or recognize it or not. Prisons were the reform. We need to keep that in mind. We need to keep stressing that and emphasizing that. Before we had prisons, we were drawing and quartering people. We were hanging people in a public square. So prisons were the reform for dealing with all kinds of social problems. This idea that someone's going to be sitting in a cage by themselves for, years or decades, sitting there, and somehow they're going to be transformed through this process is really, really part of the problem here. Reforms take for granted that prisons need to exist in our society.
Today, I'm also issuing an executive order that will ultimately end the Justice Department's use of private prisons. This is the first step to stop corporation from profiting off of incarceration that is less humane and less safe, as the studies show. And it is just the beginning of my administration's plan to address systemic problems in our criminal justice system.
My reading of the executive order really, was just kind of like, meh, like this is, it sounds good. And a lot of people will get behind it and applaud it and say, well, we need to just go for it. This is a reform. We can't just let everyone out of prison tomorrow. And the thing is, you can't really have life-affirming programming in a situation that is coercive, that is carceral. But if you do a close reading of the executive order, what they do in part right at the beginning is they borrow the language of abolitionists. It sounds like it's a good thing, but it's really not. It's really kind of rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. It gives the impression that something is happening or something is being done, when in fact there's actually no substance to it. Less than 9% of the total prison population are held in privately owned prisons. So ending prison contracts with private companies doesn't mean that the buildings that those private companies were using are going to disappear. In my imagination, what I can see very likely happening is states contracting or buying those facilities and using it perhaps under the guise of reducing the overcrowding that's happening in a lot of prisons across the country to warehouse more people. So it's really a myth that private facilities are going to be the deciding factor or the place where we end mass incarceration in this country. There's nothing in the language of this executive order that actually says we're going to let people go free. What it says instead is we need to recognize that prisons are the places for people to be safe, to keep communities safe, and that we need to rehabilitate and give people the opportunity to redeem themselves. Well, the focus on, individual rehabilitation and individual redemption misses the fact that, prisons are really being used to solve social problems. If we're serious about addressing these issues, whether we're talking about childhood sexual assault, which we can all agree is absolutely abhorrent, but prison, putting people in a cage, doesn't actually address that. We haven't eliminated childhood sexual assault. And there are a lot of people, a lot of abolitionists who've been working on these issues for years to talk about how they want to address this issue, how we can be in community with folks, not just exiling people, sending them far away from their families and removing them and never hearing from them again, to a model that basically says, if we want to transform society, we can't just shun them and pretend that they don't exist and lock them up and throw away the key. That kind of thinking is really at the root of reform. It's about disposability of human beings.